We've all thought about taking a road trip. Just you, your loved ones, and a long stretch of road to keep you occupied. Here are 3 road trip horror stories to listen to before you think about packing your bags. This happened a few decades ago when I was still in my 20s, and I was living in Wisconsin at the time. It started when a friend and I decided to pay a visit to my cousin, Rachel, who lived in Minnesota. Rachel was studying at Minnesota State University, and it had been a while since I'd seen her. This sounded like the perfect chance to live out that road trip I've always wanted to go on. We had planned to spend the weekend with her, and so Rachel had given us pretty specific directions to follow. And for context, this took place before everyone had smartphones with GPS. According to my friend, her directions were reliable, and she promised the drive wouldn't take us more than 3 hours to reach our destination. So we packed some snacks for the road and set out on the trip. We left my house around 5 p.m., and nothing seemed peculiar at first. However, after about 2 hours on the road, I noticed that we had been driving through this stretch of trees for quite some time. This is when the nightmare began. I couldn't remember when we had entered the woods, but it felt like we had been driving through them much longer than we should have. I don't know how to describe it. These weren't ordinary lines of trees with a road in between. It was constantly shifting, twisting. A winding road that seemed to have no end. Trees of vastly different species towering on either side of the road. It felt like all the surroundings seemed to lack any consistency. And every so often, I swear, I would catch an occasional glimpse of a pair of eyes staring at me from the gaps between the surrounding trees and bushes. What made it worse was when we were driving through the area, both of our flip phones lost service, and it almost felt like the trees were closing in on us. I can't forget this sense of suffocation that I felt staring out the windows. Despite all this, we continued, expecting to arrive at our destination sometime soon. As we drove out of the woods, I looked at my watch and realized that it had taken us much longer than expected. It was almost 7.5 hours since we had left, and we had only pulled over once or twice for a few minutes to check the map. Let me remind you that this was supposed to be a 3-hour trip. How were we driving through that forest for more than 7 hours? Regardless, after we finally made it out of the woods, we arrived at my cousin's place. I brought up the topic of the drive to my cousin Rachel, and of course, she didn't believe a single thing I told her. Still, some denial was good in allowing me to forget what happened and enjoy myself a little. The trip back was uneventful, and we arrived at our home in a little over 3 hours. Keep in mind that we had very specific instructions to get there, and on the way back, we followed them exactly as they were written. I made sure of it. I was expecting to go through the same long path through the woods, but it never appeared. Was I just hallucinating the whole thing? The next time, about 6 months after the first trip, I went back. Following the same directions as before, the entire trip took me about 3 hours. And every other trip I made to Minnesota in the following years also took me the same time. I've always wondered what actually happened during that initial trip when we passed through those woods. Despite my best efforts, I have never been able to replicate that experience. And a small part of me hopes that I never do. I've worked here as an accountant for 10 years here in Washington, repeating the same mundane 9-to-5 schedule all my life. I don't have a wife and kids at home, so I thought some fresh air might just be exactly what I needed. I packed my bags and set out to visit my hometown in Montana. Everything was normal for quite some time. I was actually having fun, which was quite rare since I'd never enjoyed my company. About 4 hours in, I was driving on a long, winding stretch of road. The sun had set hours ago, and the only light came from my car's headlights. My phone had lost its signal miles back, leaving me with no GPS or music to pass the time. It was just me, the road, and the darkness. I can't describe it, but there was this alarm going off in the back of my head. It started with a feeling that I was being watched, like someone or something was following me from the shadows. You know how for a split second you can see something move from the corner of your eyes? It was something like that. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I couldn't see anything but the pitch black road behind me. But the feeling just kept creeping up on me. It was an itch I couldn't scratch. I had been driving with this unsettling feeling for a little over 30 minutes. By that point, I had been looking left and right constantly, hoping to actually see something instead of just imagining things. That was when I saw it. I very clearly remember my jaw dropping from the shock of what I was seeing. In the middle of the road was a creature, I don't know, a thing, on all fours, hunched over what looked like a dead buck. My immediate reaction was to slam on the brakes as my breathing got heavier. It didn't move. Instead, it stood completely still, its eyes fixed on me. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking it might be a trick of the light. But then it started to move, walking slowly towards my car. I put the car in reverse, trying to back away from it. But as I did, I felt a sudden jolt and the car stopped. In my panic, I must have stalled the car. This was when my heart sank. The creature was now only a few feet away, and I could see that its eyes were blood red and soulless. Its fur was matted and greasy, and its mouth was dripping with the blood of the poor buck. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. At this point, I started crying uncontrollably, expecting the worst. The thing reached for me, and I just closed my eyes, tucking myself into a ball, hoping for this nightmare to end. Suddenly, the car started to shake violently. I could hear scraping and scratching noises all around me, like something was trying to claw its way in. The windows started to crack, and I could feel cold air seeping in from every crevice. In that moment, I knew I had to get out. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped inside with no escape. I don't know how long I was in there, but eventually the shaking stopped and the cold air dissipated. When I looked around, I saw that the thing was gone. My car was still in one piece. I mean, it was drivable, but the windows were broken and the doors scratched beyond belief. I started the car and drove off as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally got a signal on my phone and called for help. To this day, I don't know what happened to that creature and why it spared me, but I know that it wasn't just my imagination. My car was still in one piece. I mean, it was drivable, but the windows were broken and the doors scratched beyond belief. I started the car and drove off as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally got a signal on my phone and called for help. To this day, I don't know what happened to that creature and why it spared me, but I know that it wasn't just my imagination. I still remember the road trip I took to Georgia with my cousins in the winter. It was a pretty long journey, almost 3,000 miles on lonely highway, and I wasn't exactly excited about the trip ahead. To pass the time, I brought along some puzzles because I wasn't much of a nature freak and didn't find any satisfaction looking out to empty fields for 10+ hours. We made stops along the way, camping in the van at night to rest. On one strange night, we parked at a campground to spend the night. I was sleeping in the front passenger seat when I heard what sounded like light footsteps close to the van. This continued for about, 30 seconds, but I couldn't see anything. I brushed it off, tucked myself deep into my blanket, and went back to sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I glanced out the window and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a full face print on the window, like someone had been watching me during the night. I was creeped out because you could tell the face was looking in my direction. I'll never forget the face's features. It looked like an older man with a very distinct smile on his face. A lot of possibilities were racing through my head. Maybe someone drew it on the window to prank me, but it didn't make sense because there wasn't anyone else there. The thought that someone had been watching us while we slept was terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed or watched the entire time. I was on high alert and didn't sleep well for the entire rest of the trip. I even tried to record the nights to see if I could catch any stalker in action. But nothing. To this day, I'm not sure whose face that was.